The three deadliest exorcism failures the church buried. They were rites born of faith, forged in the belief that light, through sacred ritual, could cast out darkness, that the divine could reclaim what the demonic sought to consume. And yet, what happens when the rite fails? When prayer does not protect and ritual becomes the theater of ruin? Behind cathedral walls and beneath gilded altars, the church has waged unseen wars, not all of which ended in triumph. Some ended in death, others in silence so deliberate it became dogma. These are not the tales found in stained glass or Sunday scripture. They are the forgotten liturgies of suffering, the buried truths the church locked away beneath centuries of incense and secrecy. Each failure is not merely a tragedy, it is a philosophical wound, a disruption in the very metaphysics of salvation. Tonight, we unseal the vault. We confront the questions the church refused to answer. If this journey into the shadows of faith compels you, subscribe to the channel and let your voice be heard in the comments, because truth, like light, belongs to those who seek it. The possession that killed a nun, and the Vatican said nothing. There are silences that settle like dust forgotten, inert, gathering in the crevices of history without resistance. But then there are silences that do not rest. They thunder beneath the skin of time, gnawing at the foundations of truth, saturating the moral fabric with unease. In the cloistered stone womb of a secluded northern Italian abbey, a silence of the second kind has endured for decades, untouched by time, unchallenged by justice, unredeemed by prayer. It is the silence that followed the death of Sister Maria Benedetta, a woman who, by all appearances, embodied the sanctity that the church not only extolled, but desperately needed. She was not merely devout, she was revered, a figure of stillness so profound that to speak her name aloud felt like violating something sacred. Her every gesture appeared to be a relinquishment of self, an act of obedience not to man but to God himself. She was, in form and function, the theological ideal, obedient, contemplative, pure. And then, as if the metaphysical order of the cosmos had rejected her sanctity, she began to unravel. Not with spectacle or cataclysm, but with quiet fracture. The descent was not a moment, but a creeping presence. Flickers in her vision, unexplained bruises tracing symbols upon her skin, breathless drafts in rooms sealed tight. She began to fast, not from holy discipline, but from a bodily refusal to ingest even the Eucharist. Her sobbing disrupted the liturgical rhythm of Vespers. Her trembling distorted the serenity of the consecration. Yet it was when she spoke, her voice no longer her own, that the church could no longer deny that something had entered into the sacred. Her Latin was twisted, guttural, an inversion of the holy tongue. She did not pray, she cursed. She defiled the sacraments and laughed during funerals. What emerged was not madness, but something beyond the scope of psychological comprehension. A form of suffering that violated both the body and the spirit, that tore through the rational categories of illness and into the void of metaphysical torment. The convent's community responded as it had been taught, with prayer, fasting, and petitions to the divine. But the affliction remained coiled, relentless, unmoved by piety. In desperation, the abbess appealed beyond the monastic walls, invoking the only earthly authority capable of sanctioning what was now inevitable. The Vatican responded not with ceremony, but with quiet precision. 2 priests were sent, one elderly and scarred by battles no sermon would ever describe, the other young, eager, and bound by the iron weight of obedience. What transpired over the next 4 nights was never recorded in liturgy, nor etched into any theological treatise. There were no candlelit vigils, no sacred rites broadcast through the chants of the choir. Only whispered prayers drowned by unnatural screams, screams that did not belong to this world, that violated the very architecture of human sound. It was a spiritual battle, yes, but also a profoundly human one. It was a confrontation between the incomprehensible darkness of the unknown and the trembling fidelity of those who still dared to believe. On the 4th night, Sister Maria died. Her body, gaunt and spent, bore no visible peace. Her eyes, it is said, remained open-fixed upon the crucifix, not in reverence but in derision. There was no deliverance. Her final expression was not of salvation, but of mockery, as though something within her had expired long before her body followed suit. The cause of death, spoken in hushed tones and never recorded in official ink, was exhaustion due to spiritual torment. Yet her passing was not the end of the tragedy. It was merely the beginning of the concealment. There was no funeral open to the faithful, no communal mourning that would have dignified her suffering. The convent was closed to visitors. The elder priest was reassigned to a remote monastery where, in time, he took a vow of silence and died in obscurity. The younger priest, more troubling still, vanished entirely. His name was erased, his service unacknowledged, his fate unknown. His existence, it seemed, had become theologically inconvenient. The Vatican released no statement. There were no questions from the press, and if there were, they were met with ecclesiastical silence. No theological inquiry followed, no reflective examination of the rite, only a file locked in the labyrinthine archives beneath the apostolic palace, buried under a coded reference number, among the 1,000 failures the church dare not name. But in this carefully curated silence lies a truth too grave for liturgy. That sanctity is not immunity, and that evil does not always recoil at the presence of the sacred. Sister Maria was the ideal, and still she fell. And if evil can triumph even in the heart of purity, what then becomes of doctrine? What becomes of sacramental assurance? What happens to the theological scaffolding built upon the assumption that the divine always intercedes for the faithful? For those who were present, those who loved her, who petitioned the heavens until their voices broke, the silence that followed her death was not peace, it was betrayal, a heresy not of belief but of omission. This is the philosophical crisis that haunts her death, that the Church, in attempting to preserve its appearance of sanctity, instead enshrined its own fallibility. It did not just bury a woman, it buried a question that undermines the very premise of divine protection. If the sacred is not sufficient to repel the profane, then what is? And if ritual cannot always prevail, what remains but the abyss? Perhaps this is why the silence has become unbearable, why it does not heal but hollows. Because it is not merely the echo of a failed exorcism, it is the echo of certainty collapsing, the sound of metaphysical confidence corroding under the pressure of unspeakable truth. It is the sound of a soul believed to be saved devoured at the altar of sacred ritual. And for all its relics, robes, and rites, the Church could offer no answer. No comfort, no absolution, only silence. And in that silence, the devil found his truest victory, not by possessing a nun, but by watching the faithful bury the truth. Anneliese Michel, the exorcism that became a PR nightmare. There are names that pass gently through the annals of history, whispered, footnoted, forgotten, and then there are names that remain etched like lacerations upon the conscience of a civilization, not merely because of what they endured, but because of what they revealed. Anneliese Michel is one such name. Her story is not simply that of an exorcism gone wrong, nor is it merely a tale of suffering in a religious context. It is a philosophical rupture, an epistemological wound, where faith collided with flesh, and metaphysical belief clashed violently against the sterile certainty of biology. In Anneliese, we encounter the tragic unraveling of a human being at the intersection of two competing cosmologies, one rooted in the sacred and eternal, the other in the scientific and observable. She was not canonized. She wore no habit. She carried no ecclesiastical authority. She was an appearance and experience, an ordinary young woman, a student in post-war Germany, bright and devout in the unassuming way that earnest souls often are. But inside her, something stirred, something no diagnosis could soothe and no catechism could contain. Physicians called it epilepsy, psychiatrists psychosis, but she called it something else entirely: possession. Her language was not clinical, but metaphysical. She spoke of demons, tormentors, not of flesh, but of will entities that devoured the light in her chest and whispered desecrations into the silent chambers of her consciousness. Her body, once young and vibrant, began to collapse under the weight of that which the modern world dismissed as delusion. She refused food, claiming it was forbidden by the dark intelligences within her. She tore at her skin. She barked like a beast. And when she spoke, it was in a voice that did not belong to her. distorted, disembodied, as if rising from a chasm deeper than human language itself. The medical world responded with pills. It offered names and labels, but no meaning. Her family, devout and desperate, turned elsewhere, to the church. What followed was not simply an exorcism, it was a theological spectacle cloaked as pastoral care, a metaphysical confrontation disguised as liturgical procedure. Over the course of 67 sessions spanning 10 harrowing months, Anneliese's body became a battlefield. Her suffering was absorbed into ritual, her agony transfigured into something the priests believed to be sacred. In their eyes, she was a martyr, not dying but offering herself as a vessel through which the church might confront darkness. They recited ancient prayers over her deteriorating frame as if performing a liturgical sacrifice. But to others, especially in the eyes of the watching world, this was not redemptive suffering. It was institutional neglect, sanctified by incense and invocation. And then, she died. The doctors called it starvation. Her death certificate recorded what her body had long revealed. But what ended her life was not merely malnutrition. It was the unrelenting pressure of two ideologies, science and religion, both convinced of their righteousness, yet equally incapable of seeing her. One saw her as a patient, the other as a battlefield. Neither saw her as a person. In the aftermath, outrage surged. The media called it medieval cruelty. The courts called it negligent homicide. The church, caught between scandal and doctrine, called it a tragedy, then did what it has done throughout history when faced with inconvenient suffering. It retreated into silence. Anneliese was not martyred. Her name was not enshrined in sacred memory. The church did not defend the priests with the full armor of its theological inheritance. It left them to the mercy of secular law and quietly excised her story from its official narrative. Yet Anneliese's story has endured not because of the horror of her death, but because of the philosophical questions she left behind. Was she truly possessed, or was she destroyed by the very institution that claimed to save her? Was she a vessel for demonic forces, or a casualty of theological dogmatism? If she was possessed, then her death was, in the church's own language, a sanctified offering suffering endured for a higher spiritual purpose. But if she was not, if her demons were symptoms of unaddressed trauma, misunderstood illness, or existential despair, then her death becomes something far more haunting. Murder cloaked in liturgy. Philosophically, her case exposes the fragility of religious epistemology when confronted with the ambiguity of suffering. The church, so long armored by the certainties of tradition and divine authority, found itself paralyzed, unable to commit fully to either confession or denial. It wanted to believe in exorcism, but not in the cost of its failure. It wished to be the guardian of souls, but not the bearer of blame. And so Anneliese became not merely a ghost to her grieving family, but to the church itself, a spectral reminder of the dangerous space between conviction and responsibility. In the modern world so dominated by scientific rationalism and empirical frameworks, Anneliese's case became less about spirits and more about meaning. Was her agony the mark of divine mystery, or the failure of human systems to dignify her pain? Is a misdiagnosis more damning than a false ritual? And perhaps the most important question of all, does the distinction even matter when the outcome is the same? A young woman died, bones visible beneath taut skin, surrounded by men who believed they were saving her, and by a world that refused to agree on whether she was dying of madness or metaphysical warfare. The photographs remain. Eyes hollow, flesh wasted, face contorted in agony. The tapes exist, her voice, distorted and animalistic, crying out through the veil of suffering. These artifacts are not relics of devotion. They are evidence of despair. And in them we do not hear a woman saved or a demon expelled. We hear the trembling, unsteady voice of a church caught between its desperate need to believe and its paralytic fear of being wrong. Anneliese Michel did not die quietly. She died as a question one the church has never fully dared to answer. Buried in the crypts, the child who died screaming, "He's still inside me." There are moments in history so steeped in sorrow that even stone, in its mute permanence, seems to retain their memory, not as echo, but as wound. Such is the tale of Julian, a boy of only 9 years, whose life was not merely lost, but swallowed by the shadows beneath the crypt of a rural church outside Lyon, France, sometime in the 1950s. His story does not appear in catechisms, nor does it find refuge in the indexed annals of diocesan history. Instead, it lingers in the margins of ecclesial memory, carried in whispers, in trembling recollections, in the flicker of votive candles left by villagers who still, decades later, light flames at the edge of a forgotten grave. Julien was a child marked not by sin, but by sensitivity, not by deviance, but by a perception so acute it verged on the metaphysical. He spoke not of nightmares, but of dreams being devoured of something that lived inside his chest, gnawing not at his body, but at the essential fibers of his being. When exposed to Scripture, he bled from the nose. When brought to Mass, he collapsed, not theatrically, but violently. And yet, after each episode, he wept, not in fear, but in horror, for he had no memory of what he had done. He had struck his siblings, then begged their forgiveness, saying he heard the other voice command him. The village doctor offered no clarity. The school teacher, overwhelmed and unprepared, resigned. And so his parents, humble, pious, and increasingly desperate, sought recourse in the only institution that still claimed dominion over darkness, the church. What unfolded thereafter was not merely pastoral care. It was one of the most ethically and theologically disquieting episodes in the subterranean history of modern Catholicism. The priest who accepted the case had long been admired for his piety, though whispered about for his fixation on demonic possession. After consultation with two bishops and a monk renowned for spiritual discernment, he was granted canonical approval to proceed. But the rite would not take place in the light of the nave, before the eyes of the faithful. There would be no community, no daylight, no sanctuary of song. The exorcism was to be performed in the crypt space formerly reserved for relics and the bones of saints, now repurposed as a chamber of desperation and dread. There beneath stone and silence, the boy was restrained. Holy words were not whispered as balm, but hurled like spears into the abyss. The intention, presumably, was salvation. The result was annihilation. On the second night, Julien died. The official cause, recorded in precise and impersonal Latin cor arrestum per agitationem animi offered, cardiac arrest due to emotional trauma. But such sterile phrasing cannot contain the horror of what occurred. A letter penned by a deacon present at the ritual and later intercepted and sealed within the Vatican described the final moments. The boy, gasping for air, turned his eyes to the priest and uttered with a clarity that cut through the ritual's chaos, "He's still inside me. Don't let him stay." Then came a scream so inhumanly piercing that candles cracked, icons fell, and one sister above collapsed unconscious. It was not merely a death. It was an ontological rupture, one that challenged not only the efficacy of exorcism, but the metaphysical premises upon which the Church had long declared its authority. If a child innocent, uninitiated, and unarmed against both sin and reason can be so violently consumed within the heart of the sacred, what then becomes of the Church's claims to power? What happens when its most solemn rite fails not just to heal, but to preserve life? The priest who led the ritual did not remain silent. He spoke not to the media, nor to skeptics, but to the hierarchy itself. And for that, he was defrocked. Not condemned publicly, but disappeared, relocated, ignored, eventually cast adrift. He was last seen in Madrid, destitute and branded a heretic. His crime was not the exorcism itself. It was his refusal to uphold the silence that followed. The Church, keenly aware of its institutional fragility in an increasingly secular world, acted swiftly. The priest was replaced. The incident denied. Julien's body was not given the dignity of interment in consecrated ground. Instead, he was laid to rest in an unmarked plot at the edge of town, as though even in death he remained an ecclesial inconvenience, an impurity too dangerous to acknowledge. Why such suppression? Because to confess that a child died under the auspices of sacramental authority during a rite explicitly designed to confront evil would be to confess impotence. And impotence is not simply a public relations problem, it is a theological crisis. It undermines the sacramental imagination. It suggests that divine authority is not absolute, but conditional, fragile in the face of certain darkness. And so the crypt remains sealed, not as a shrine, but as a vault of institutional memory, deliberately suppressed. The villagers still speak his name, not in anger, but in reverent sorrow. They light candles, not in hope of miracles, but in the quiet request for mercy. The Vatican, when pressed, maintains its denial. There is no record of this case, but the stones beneath the church remember. The blood absorbed by its mortar whispers through the silence. Theology may redact, canon law may deny, but truth, like trauma, resists erasure. It does not disappear, it stains. Julian, voiceless, buried and abandoned, not only represents a human tragedy, but stands as a philosophical indictment. He is the embodiment of what happens when faith is severed from humility, when ritual is stripped of compassion, when power masks itself in piety and forgets the soul it was meant to protect. His story is not merely a historical anomaly. It is a mirror held to the face of institutional religion, asking, what are we willing to bury in order to survive? And perhaps more disturbingly, what remains buried, still screaming, beneath our altars of silence? The secret Vatican memo. Never speak of this again. Beneath the polished marble of the Apostolic Palace, beneath ceilings adorned with frescoes of divinely inspired triumph and corridors echoing with centuries of liturgical certainty, there exists a vault, not a sanctuary of reverence, but a chamber of repression. This space is not warmed by candlelight, nor sanctified by prayer. It is sterile, fortified not by angels, but by bureaucracy, and what it contains is not doctrine, but dread. Within its sealed drawers and coded compartments lie the remnants of ecclesiastical anomalies, episodes so antithetical to the Church's self-image that they must be quarantined from history itself, lest the illusion of sacred omnipotence be disturbed. Among these suppressed testaments exists a folder marked, not with a name, not even a place, but with a sterile numerical code, 1983-043X. It is not simply a case file, it is a burial, a metaphysical interment, not only in archival obscurity, but in deliberate epistemological denial. The document details a Vatican-sanctioned exorcism in Mexico City, executed under full authority of the Archdiocese. It involved 3 afflicted individuals and a senior exorcist, an experienced priest who had devoted decades to spiritual warfare. None survived. What transpired within those walls is known only through what the redactors failed to erase. Blood pooled and splattered on the ceiling, Latin incantations etched into concrete with no physical instrument, and a neighbor's testimony of 10 voices weeping through a single throat, a sound so viscerally unnatural that he fled the city, never to return. The house was demolished without ceremony within weeks. Its location, now an unmarked parking lot, bears no plaque, no trace its mundane surface, quietly sealing a void of unspeakable horror no sacrament could ever consecrate. Yet the event endures not in public record, but in a secret directive known only to a select circle within the ecclesiastical hierarchy, Silentium Memorandum. This confidential memorandum, signed by a cardinal and written in 6 languages to ensure absolute clarity, carried a singular instruction: never speak of this again. The consequences of exposure are eternal. This church does not survive scandal. Not again. In those words lies the church's unspoken admission. That truth, even when divine in content, can be existentially catastrophic in consequence. The exorcism in question was not merely a spiritual failure. It was a theological embarrassment, a liturgical implosion, a moment wherein the elaborate architecture of divine authority collapsed beneath the raw, chaotic force of the real. The ritual, the vestments, the Latin prayers, the sacramentals had not prevailed. They had not protected. They had not healed. They had failed completely. And that failure, unlike doctrinal controversy or clerical misconduct, could not be rationalized. It was unfiltered. It was physical. It was absolute. The vault exists precisely because the Church, in its yearning for eternal certainty, cannot abide the chaos of the inexplicable. It cannot admit that its sacred rites might fail. That evil, when encountered in its most grotesque and unmediated form, may not yield to oil and incantation. Thus, the institution edits, silences, and erases not merely to shield itself from the gaze of the secular world, but to preserve its internal metaphysical coherence. For if even one exorcism ends not in liberation but in death and madness, then the ontological foundation of the rite must be interrogated. Was it truly a confrontation with the demonic, or merely an exercise in ritualized hubris? Was it a conduit of grace, or a mask through which terror wore the garments of sanctity? Herein lies the deeper philosophical tension, the chasm between institutional truth and existential horror. To believe in exorcism is to admit the reality of evil, not as metaphor, but as metaphysical substance. To perform one is to stand at the edge of language and meaning, where theology falters and darkness speaks in tongues beyond comprehension. But to conceal a failed exorcism, to redact cries, to cloak the remains of the exorcist in clerical silence, is no longer the practice of faith. It becomes an act of a metaphysical deceit, fear disguised as devotion, control masquerading as holiness. And it is in this disguise that the most terrifying implication resides, that the Church, when confronted by the truly unspeakable, no longer trusts the power of truth to redeem it, trusts only the power of secrecy to preserve. The Silentium Memorandum, then, is not merely a document, it is a confession, a rare moment where the Church, through the veil of bureaucratic language, acknowledges the boundaries of its dominion, and in doing so admits something even more terrifying, that sometimes evil wins. When it does, it is not cast out, it is not confronted again, it is not even named. It is buried, not in chains, but in archives, not in excommunication, but in footnotes that never appear, hidden from the light but never truly destroyed. For evil, once witnessed and denied, does not disappear, it ferments, it festers. And silence within the theology of trauma is never mere absence, it becomes complicity.